Morning, I have the pleasure of presenting John Calvin, which I do with some trepidation because I happened to be on a few weeks ago when Father Bob Dana was on, and I can't remember the exact phrase he said, but it was along the lines of "good luck making him into an Easter person." Um, so I'm going to just wipe away the mystery of that from the very beginning and take the easy road out that if you are a Christian, a believer in Jesus Christ, and that he died and rose from the grave, then I'm going to call you an Easter person. But we are going to find out that there might be an issue or two with that when it comes to John Calvin. So we'll see what happens with him. So as you can see from his nameplate, 1509 to 1564, so really not an incredibly long life for that time in history. To put it in context, Martin Luther was born a number of years earlier, about 25 years earlier. John Calvin was born, and when he was still a child, Martin Luther was tacking his 95 Theses onto the Wittenberg door for the beginning of what's thought of as the Protestant Reformation. And then 1534, when John Calvin was finishing some of his formal studies, is when the Church of England came into being. That date's a little bit fluid because do you consider it to be simply when Henry broke relations with the Pope? Was it more the formal establishment of the church? So, but in the area of 1534. And then something that's going to become significant as we talk today, 1536 is when John Calvin published his first major work on his theology. So this just kind of gives you a little perspective of where he fit in with the Reformation and the turning away more from the Roman Catholic Church and trying to delve into more, what should be man's relationship with God and how do we stand with that? His name, probably more in French here, Jean Calvin. He was born in a small town, a fairly small town in a province in France. His parents, both French, but his mother, not as influential, and I think that she actually died when he was still fairly young because the father had much, much more to do with raising the children than mother did. Mother had been raised by an innkeeper. The father, Gerard Calvin, was a cathedral notary, a registrar to the ecclesiastical court. And that would be pretty significant at that time. We'd probably call it, in this day and age, the county clerk of courts, because the ecclesiastical courts settled many civil issues between members of the church. So it wasn't simply about religious topics. So his father was the registrar for the ecclesiastical court. And John had at least two brothers, and I think he also had a sister, but the dad intended them, the sons, to all become priests. He thought that was a way of keeping the family in good standing with the church. So he expected the sons would all become priests. And to that end, John was only 12 years old when he became a clerk for the bishop, working in the office, and had his hair cut in the tonsure, which was a very visible symbol of your dedication to the church. So this happened at a fairly young age. Now, that's when John was 12. Interestingly, for a dad who wanted all of his sons to become priests, when John was 16 or 17, his father withdrew him from priestly studies and enrolled him in the study of law because he apparently decided that it would be a much more lucrative career. So apparently dad had a little bit of a change of heart. I did try to look to see, did he change the schooling for all of his sons? And I did not find it, but he did change it for John. One wonders also, as father was getting along in years, was he hoping to have, a son who could support him when he was older? But he did change John's area of study to that of law. And when he was 23, he received his licentiate in law. So this would have been about 1532. And that was right in the middle of a period of time in his life from the age of about 21 to 24. Now, putting that in context, let's see, if he was born in 1509, so we're talking about 1530. So now this is 12, 15 years after Martin Luther's split with the church. And we do have to constantly remind ourselves that, people at this time did not have texting and email and WhatsApp or any other means of communication. And so for things to get from city to city and country to country could take years. So this was about 15 to 20 years after Luther had split with the Catholic Church. And John Calvin underwent a time of conversion. And the way that he phrased it was this, these were his words. And I wanted to touch on that idea about his comment about himself, that his mind was more hardened in such matters. And this came about also from a conversation with Father Bob, in which we were reminding ourselves about the period of time. So we tend to be rather broad-minded in these days. We tend to think that people of different social levels of social standing can be members of the church, whether specifically the Episcopal Church or just any Christian church. We tend to think people who have different opinions about finance or law can be members of the same church. We believe that people of different political parties can be members of the same church. And this would not have been true in Calvin's time. And so this idea that his mind was hardened in such matters, where you went to church was also affected by where you lived and the political atmosphere at the time. And we have no better example of that than the creation of the Church of England, establishing the head of that church as the king or queen of the time. So John Calvin probably saw things a little bit more black and white than we are used to with our clergy and theological thinkers today. But he said he went through this conversion experience. He went through where he had a sudden conversion. He credits it to God. And as I said, this would have been in the time from ages 21 to 24. Now, he made a friend at this time who was significant, a person named Nicholas Kopp. And Nicholas Kopp was a theologian and a very studied person. He became the rector of the College de Royal in France, which later became simply the College of France. But in an inaugural address there, he spoke very passionately about the need for reform and renewal in the Roman Catholic Church. France was a very Roman Catholic country, and he was speaking of the need for reform and renewal. And so basically he had to go on the run. He had to move around. And where he did this moving, so, much of life, of course, is centered in Paris. And that is where the college is. But then the end, that's the Noyon, that was John Calvin's hometown. And that's one of the places where Nicholas Kopp fled. Another one was Orleans, down here with the O. But then eventually to Basel in Switzerland. And the real significance of going to Basel, because at a certain point in this journey, John joined him, met up with him, and wherever Nicholas was going to be, John was going to be also. And the significance of going to Basel is that let's see if I can blow this up. So you see where Basel is here, and then you see this gray line up here on the, just sort of straight through the B and then underneath it. Well, this is Germany, but it is way, way removed from Wittenberg. This is clearly the very southwestern corner of Germany, and Wittenberg is very much in the northeast. So they are not closely related geographically. And because of relocating to Basel at that time, eventually, rather than stay there, the movement was made to the larger city, which is Geneva. And the interesting thing about Geneva is that, yes, it's part of Switzerland, but if you look at it, it's actually just this kind of little piece of land that juts into France. So this is France above, this is France below, this is France to the left. France is all around, but yet Geneva is part of Switzerland, and it's just in this little piece of Switzerland that really kind of sticks into France. And so Geneva is very, very French in nature, and that is absolutely the language that is spoken there. During this time, so we have him from ages 21 to 24. So this would have been about 15, maybe up to, let's say, 1533, 34. In 1536, when he was 27 years old, John published his first studied work, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. And this was a work which he did update and republish several times during his life, but the crux of it, the beginning of it, was in this 1536 when it was originally published. And 5 years later is when he really moved to Geneva to stay. And that's where his influence, the influence of this book, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, really kind of took off. So let's see here. That back down to that side. Okay, we look at the quote. So this is when he published the book, 1536. And what that book really was the beginnings of what we've now come to call Calvinism. And it's called different things depending upon where you are, the Reformed faith or Reformed Protestantism. So it's interesting to me that Protestantism had really just been established, not even 20 years before, and yet now we're already reforming it. It does follow the traditions of Christianity, but, and the emphasis in the last sentence is mine, the italics in the blue print, emphasizes the sovereignty of God and the authority of the Bible. And that was very, very different from the Catholic Church. Sovereignty of God, you might argue for in the Catholic Church. Authority of the Bible, not quite as much, because of course they had a very well-defined hierarchy that they believed in. And so that's where we stand at that time now. So it's kind of, we want to now kind of take a look at what Calvinism included. But I'd like to pause for a moment just to kind of take a survey. Are there things that you are aware of that Calvinism did include or did espouse? Are there things that you've heard different times in your life when in different parts of your religious journey?
So is Calvinism part of the predestination that we hear about with the Presbyterians in particular? But I'm also remembering that although we know a couple of key figures in terms of the Protestant Reformation, there were many other agitators, including in Zurich and Zwingli. And I mean, there were lots of people who were stirring the pot at the time. And I also think that we forget that there was a counter-reformation, so that the Roman Catholic Church responded and reformed itself in many ways. So we think, well, that was just a critique and it was ignored and we had to start our own church and so on. But there was much more of a fluid dynamic going on in this whole period of Reformation. Mm-hmm. So we have a tendency not to teach the Counter-Reformation or the other writers and theologians as much as Luther and Calvin. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I've always thought that the Calvinists were pretty rigid, especially the new Calvinists. They're kind of an interesting bunch that has, again, emerged in kind of pushback to more liberal theologies or feminist theologies or whatever. So it's a constant dynamic, I think.
But that seems to be true, I think, in so many facets of Christianity. You know, the Benedictines have a long history going back to 500-600, and yet they've been around for a while, and then the Cistercians come along, and they're
yes.
actually the Order of Cistercians of the Strict Observance, OCS. Yes. Because, of course, the Benedictines, you know, they were only praying 7 times a day. They were not being rigid enough, and so we need the Cistercians to clean us up. And then
the Jesuits,
and
right?
then the Jesuits, the Carthusians, you know,
wonderful Jesuits.
What group you have that is exercising their practice of religion, somebody decides that no, they're not doing it right. You know, they're not good enough. So we've got to get them better. So, yeah. And you also mentioned that this idea has now come on down to, in the U.S., what we call the Presbyterian Church. And there's obviously a good reason for that, because one of John Calvin's contemporaries would have been John Knox, who was the head of the Scottish Protestant Church. Yeah. And that's where the U.S. Presbyterian Church came down. So there are connections all the way through.
Nina? In a more modern time, in the early 1800s, the Christian church was started, and they, I think, based a lot of their thought and their teaching on Calvinism. Mm-hmm. And one of the people that started this, was from Scotland. Mm-hmm. And that church, their thought was that we would stop denominations and we would all be one. And that happened about in the 1820s. Mm-hmm. So you can see his teachings coming down through the years.
Michael?
Yes.
In all fairness, though, couldn't we say that Calvin's values or perspective of the sovereignty of God, and of the authority of the Bible are one way of reacting to the belief in the life and times of Jesus Christ and the resurrection? And strict though they are, it is one interpretation. So I don't see it. I mean, we've jested about how is he an Easter person, but I think he's entitled to that title.
And that was my reason for making the point at the beginning, that to me, truly, if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, I don't see any way you cannot be described as an Easter person. And so I think that is definitely true. I don't know, Nina, that we've had success in the stop having so many denominations. We seem to have just grown in it. Although now the thing seems to be the real growth in the mega churches are in the non-denominational ones, whose theology can differ from week to week depending upon who the speaker in the pulpit is. So
I think you're exactly right.
Those are interesting ones. Okay. So if we take a look at some of what is Calvinism, what does it refer to? So
Are you there, Michael?
Yes, okay. One of the reasons for the Protestant Reformation of any form, whether it was in Wittenberg or Basel, Geneva, Zurich, one of the reasons for it had to do with the fact that the Roman Catholic Church had not really strayed from their foundational beliefs in Christ, but some of their practices really had strayed. And so there was this idea that somehow you could buy your way into heaven with the purchase of indulgences. And if you couldn't buy your way into heaven, you could certainly speed up the process and get there sooner than you would otherwise if you would make certain purchases or make certain donations to the church. And this was true even for things that you might think of as being good practices, like making a pilgrimage. And certainly the idea that you travel to go to a religious site, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But it would be with the understanding that you would pay a fee to tour the place that you were going to go to, or you would tip the priest or whoever else was working in the church at that time. And so these were the ideas that Calvin was reacting to when he was saying what it says here, that you can only approach God through faith in Christ, not through the mass or pilgrimages or things like that. That it really had to be this personal belief in God that you had and that you adhered to, that you lived up to, that was your way to salvation. So that was one of the beliefs of Calvinism, but it really was based around the fact that God is supreme and everything centers on him. I found this belief particularly intriguing when I thought of the emphasis in our own practices today in the Episcopal Church. And if you look in the Book of Common Prayer in the Catechism, there's a section devoted to baptism and a section devoted to Eucharist. And then really there's just a section that says, and the other sacraments. And so Calvin really had the same belief that Episcopalians are adhering to, which is that baptism is the introduction of anyone to the church, and then what's necessary that you do as a member of the church as you get older is that you keep coming closer to Christ and trying to align yourself with him, and you do that by practicing receiving the Eucharist. Everything else is kind of optional. And so I thought that that was an interesting connection between what Calvin was doing and what we are still thinking today in our faith system. Please, yeah, thank you. Debbie was kind enough to step in and turn the lights on because apparently I'm being too motionless, and so the lights went off. If you've read this little passage, this is where we get into the part where Calvinism really kind of takes this to an extreme. So man is corrupt, God is omnipotent and omnipresent, and that God, therefore, before the world began, predestined some for eternal salvation, and others would suffer everlasting damnation. You don't have to get much farther than the names that he gave to them, the elect and the reprobates. It's a little bit tough to think about that God has, from the beginning of time, from before time began, had already determined what each of us would be. But that is one of the views of Calvinism. Now, there's a little bit of leeway here. It's a little bit interesting how current ideas are kind of woven into this, and yet there's some clear differences. So the idea that grace is a gift which is given to us and cannot be earned is an idea that many people still think of. But the idea that divine grace cannot be challenged, you know, the fact that one person gets another one doesn't, that can't be challenged. And the other thing is, and it'll be a little bit clearer when I bring up the next statement, a reprobate could, by behaving decently, achieve an inner conviction of salvation. But notice that they are specifying there an inner conviction of salvation. An elect could never fall from grace. That just cannot happen. But a reprobate could, at best, achieve an inner conviction of salvation. So couldn't really change their standing in the eyes of God, but could do it within themselves. And then this is a quote from the Institutes that Calvin wrote. So some reaction to this statement, to any of the previous ones, but especially to this one, thoughts that you have about it? Do you see parts of it that we still adhere to? Do you see things that are not in line with how you think about your relationship with God?
Where does free will of humankind fit into this? I see God's will. I don't see man's will.
Mm-hmm.
Michael.
Yes, ma'am.
On the one before, when he talked about the chosen few, all my life I've heard, and my Jewish friends will tell you, they were the chosen few.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there is that passage in Revelations that actually gives us the number, 144,000.
Right.
That's always puzzles me a little bit, because the Mormons are big about talking about the 144,000. Meanwhile, they're doing all that genealogical research and baptizing every grandparent you ever had who may or may not be still living with us on earth. So somehow that 144,000 must be a little flexible. I'm not sure. But yes, that idea of the chosen few.
So partially, I would say this is problematic for God's declaration of creation as being good, mm-hmm. and humanity as being good, and the theology of co-reflective, co-equal. It really continues a fallen state, I would say. Mm-hmm. And that whole piece is certainly not part of current theology. And I'm trying to remember, Cranmer did 2 revisions of the Mass during the English Reformation. And part of the controversy was where he put certain elements of the Eucharistic canon. And I'm trying to remember more about that, and I'm struggling with that at the moment. I'm sorry. But the creedal statements became more important. The Lord's Prayer, the common prayer of the people of God, and where that occurred in the worship. But the Eucharist was not wasn't the only means of experiencing grace. So in fact, for many years, it was prayer.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't Eucharist every week, the way we have come to enjoy that in our tradition, but certainly that was still true for the Roman Catholic Church. So I don't know. And I don't think that many of us believe that people are damned for eternity. That doesn't seem to be consistent with our understanding of Jesus and his role. So I'm not a Calvinist.
How many times have you heard people say, I am praying for her or him to be saved, because if they are not saved, then they will not go to heaven. And the terrible angst of a person who says that, because his or her compulsion, whole reason for life, is to help those other people be saved so that they can go to heaven.
Mm-hmm. And then the flip side of that last line in this last passage on the screen, an elect could never fall from grace.
Yeah.
No matter what your actions, no matter what your statements, no matter if you blaspheme the Holy Spirit, you know, there's that idea that we often attribute now to the Southern Baptists about once saved, always saved, regardless of what your beliefs continue to be or your practices continue to be. And so that's the flip side, Owen, to what I'm thinking that you're saying about how you can receive the grace to begin with, which is purely a gift, you know, it's poured out on us without measure. So.
Yeah. How wide are God's arms?
Mm-hmm.
And that statement that you quoted, Owen, makes me feel convinced that many people leave religion because it's experienced as oppressive, imposing my will on yours or my beliefs on yours, in opposition to a free access to God, which is universal and comes in many, many ways. So, and I keep trying to think, remember that this guy was young. when he wrote a theological tome that has continued to influence so many people. I mean, there was no real maturity there. And if he said that he was coming into being more flexible and to accept different teachings, this really has been seen as a rigid theology.
Yes.
Yeah.
But one area that I want to, and I don't have this on the screen, I have it in my notes, that goes along, Linda, with what you're saying about, Calvinism is very much a personal belief. It must be committed to personally. Not dependent on the whims of whatever person happens to be Pope at the time. The papal notion of infallibility is relatively recent. So it was not practiced or wasn't believed at this time.
Right.
And so truly, whatever the Pope just thought of one day, well, let's all believe this now, or let's add this practice. And it might be something different than his predecessor or successor might have suggested. And so therefore, what Calvinism is, it's a belief that's not dependent on the whims of an individual, nor on those purchasing of indulgences or relics or making pilgrimages. And this statement caught my eye. You may have been a reprobate in the eyes of God, but you would not know this. You know, this predestination occurred, but you did not know if you were a reprobate or an elect. And so the person would lead a life for God to fully get to know him. And I thought that was an interesting statement of that type of Calvinism.
Where does Psalm 1, what psalm is it? That God knows every hair on our head. Where does that psalm fit into that? God, the creator who knows us before we were formed in our mother's wombs. Mm-hmm. One of the things that concerns me about this theology is how it was justified biblically. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really something for us still to look at today. Mm-hmm. It's a real red flag for me that seems to stir things up.
Now, the way that it spread, his base by this point was Geneva, which is very much French speaking. And so from there, Calvinism was pushed out to other European cities. In France, they were called Huguenots. Calvinists were French Huguenots. And that name might be familiar with you, to some of you, if you visited Charleston, because that's a picture from the nameplate outside the French Protestant church in Charleston, which is often called the Huguenot Church. And what's again amazing to me is that it was organized about 1681. This was like 120, 130 years after Calvin published his Institutes. And that might seem like a long time, but I keep going back to the fact that communication was not instantaneous, nor at that time were there that many people living on this side of the Atlantic, and certainly not French-speaking or English-speaking people. And so the idea that this French Huguenot church was organized in Charleston is kind of a testament to how well it spread and how quickly the message got out. It went all around France. And one thing, again, a parallel to the Church of England or Episcopal Church is that one of the reasons it actually spread quickly in France was because people viewed it as a religion that had no links to Italy. It was almost more a nationalistic virtue to them to be a member of the Calvinism than it would be to be a member of the Catholic Church, which was so linked to Italy. And so some of the people, there were religious concerns about the Catholic Church. For others, they didn't have that many religious concerns about the Catholic Church, but they didn't want to be, as a French person, they did not want to be linked to Italy. And so therefore Calvinism seemed a little bit more palatable to them.
This was also, wasn't it a result of what we would now call immigration, where the missionaries they became missionaries, but the Huguenots in particular fled Europe because they were persecuted and ended up in the new United States. And settlements all along the coast were formed around specific religious communities based on who was in the boat on the way over.
In the book that I finished last summer about my family, I had to get into the Huguenot situation a lot. The family came in 1641 from France. And many years later, in the 1900s, actually, one of my uncles joined the Huguenot Church. So I sent to Charleston. It's not a church; it's an organization at the Huguenots. And so I sent and got his papers so that I could see who he had joined under. And it was indeed the people that had come to this country. So I went to a Huguenot meeting, and I knew I could never go back because they were putting the Catholic Church down so, unreal down. And I can't put any denomination down because some parts of all denominations probably have some truth to them. And so I never went back, but I did have to get into studying what they were doing, what the Huguenots stood for. And I wrote about it a little, not a whole lot, but I did write some about it.
One thing that came up when I was reading this, actually, I do want to mention one other thing that I did not delve into because I started to and I found a huge rabbit hole and I did not want to go down that rabbit hole. But Calvin, as he was developing his theology and as he was exchanging with colleagues at the time, they were still dealing with Arianism. And I was kind of taken aback by that. I thought that had been resolved back in 300, 400. But now here we are, 1500, and Arianism is still an issue to theologians. And I just found that kind of fascinating, especially given today is Trinity Sunday. So I want to mention that, and I started to research into that aspect just because I really do find it interesting, but it seemed to be one of those side issues that would absorb the main issue. So I sort of set that one aside, and maybe that's something I'll take up over the summer. But I did come across this, which I find completely interesting, that there are people, including economists, who give John Calvin credit as being the father of Western capitalism. The idea of what we now know as the Protestant work ethic, and also some of his hardline beliefs, the predestination, were embraced by aggressive capitalists. So they use that as theological justification for propelling economic growth. And so I find that that's somewhat interesting. Now, Max Weber gave Calvin complete credit for that, which not only drove capitalist success, but also, it says here, the excess that's prevalent in Northern Europe and North America. Others, though, say that Calvin kind of got a bum rap and that it was really more people who came after him who used his teachings to support a particular position when more than likely the teaching had never been intended to support that position. And so Bosma had suggested that Calvin could actually be quoted in support of both sides of the issue of capitalism. And so finally, this was the conclusion that I came to in that section, that Max Weber did give Calvin credit for sanctifying the Protestant work ethic, but Calvin never accepted capitalism unconditionally. But that was just something that surprised me. I had not connected Calvinism with Western capitalism, but apparently he's given credit for parts of it anyway.
So that's curious, isn't it, that he would promote a works ethic or a works theology when he really condemned others for doing the same thing, for earning their salvation. He has this kind of subtext that's involved with living a sanctified life so that you had an inner conviction and God just might notice all your good works and save you.
Mm-hmm. Well, but I don't know that he ever said that. He kept on referring to an inner conviction, right. That he never then made that leap and said, and therefore you can somehow become part of the elect. And that's the reason that I can live with, you mentioned that this seems to run afoul of his getting away from the indulgence and so forth. Well, this is personal for us. It's a personal decision to have this Protestant work ethic. You don't pay anybody for it. Nobody gains from it in that way. And basically there's no promise at the end of it. So, which is rather defeatist.
So the brownie points are all for yourself?
Apparently, yes.
Okay.
And anyone who's been part of an organization of any size, like more than 2 people, you surely have found out that there are times that if you are not patting yourself on the back, there are no pats being given. Yeah. So sometimes that is a little necessary.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyone with any other thoughts or observations? I've got the collect for John Calvin that we can close with, but any other thoughts or observations? May 28th, by the way, is his day in the lectionary.
I had a question, Michael. You've done a beautiful job with this. In all of your research, a lot of it to me sounds like kind of a spiritual caste system, which is sort of interesting to ponder. And I wonder about John Calvin, the man. In all of your research, did you ever read of any Jesus-like deeds, some altruistic leanings, some stories of living a Christ-like life, not from a judicial standpoint, but from a humanistic standpoint.
Mm-hmm. And Claire, thank you for your lovely compliment. And I will confess, I didn't research this as thoroughly as a theologian might. You know, I was basically trying to get my book report done for class.
It's a great book report. I just wondered if he had a heart.
But here's what I can tell you. I certainly never came across anything that spoke the opposite way, where he went out of his way to somehow do a disservice to people. But no, I did not come across any personal anecdotes like that. Although to be to be fair, I did look at several different sources, but they all had to do with the tenets of Calvinism and not
right.
Really. So I don't know that I would have come across those.
That's such a great question, Claire, because therein lies the description of Easter people. Mm-hmm. So living out the faith.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we will close with the collect for John Calvin. Sovereign and holy God, you brought John Calvin from a study of legal systems to understand the godliness of your divine laws as revealed in Scripture. Fill us with a like zeal to teach and preach your word, that the whole world may come to know your Son, Jesus Christ, the true word and wisdom, who with you and the Holy Spirit lives and reigns, ever one God, in glory everlasting. Amen. Amen.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
So that brings the conclusion to the portion of the Faith Forum devoted to Easter people. And then next week, the Faith Forum changes gears with a look at a variety of short stories. And we have the most gifted and wonderful presenter for the first week of that. And that would be Miss Owen Weber Courtney. So.
And just so you know, those we're going to put the PDF of these short stories online as long as I can find every one of them. So a small good thing for next week will be up there on the website tomorrow.
Okay. All right. Well, blessed Trinity Sunday to all of you, and see you all next week.
Thank you, Michael. That was fantastic. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much.